Welcome, everyone. Peace and love from the Atlantean consciousness. This is Grandmaster Dr. Thor Templar, and as usual, I will be your guide. And as usual, we are the light shining in a dark pit of stinky mush. So we will enlighten you on yet another fascinating topic, and I want to cover, something in occultism, something that's come up recently that's come to my attention, and I always find it amusing. But like so many areas of magic, there's this glorification or almost awe, or people think there's something special about the Kabalah. Which is basically nothing more than Judaism in its different forms. And Judaism in general, the Kabalah, the Tree of Life, all these things that so many occultists slavishly follow. Of course, so many of the grimoires are based in these traditions. Solomon's seals, the lesser and greater key of King Solomon. And so many sigils are based in these Old Testament angels and so forth. So, a lot of magic comes from there. And why does that come from there? Because, those are some of the things that have survived. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily any good. And, what's interesting is, 500 or 1,000 years from now, the books that survive will probably be very low-level Llewellyn crap, or the masses that were printed by the hundreds of thousands. And, generally, these things are okay. Are they the best books? Are those the ones that will be saved? Well, it's interesting because, when you're a publisher like the Guild, and who for many years, because of our purity and empowerments, have been ignored by so many authors who don't even bother to read our books and referencing them in bibliographies, because they weren't as easy to get. Libraries haven't bought our books. Of course, they cost you thousands on the net if you want to get our classic old text. So they haven't even tried. I've never had an author come to me of any renowned or note that has even asked for books to read or information or quizzed us on anything. Absolutely nothing. So this is the quality of the kind of authorship and research you're getting out there, when the Guild was the first to put all of these books in the mass public reach, and the first ones to ever do translations of all the great texts. And of course, that's completely ignored by these. So, what I'm saying is that when you get a mass opinion of something, you have to be very careful of that particular source. And something, because it's old, because it's based in a religion that people are semi-acceptable of. And let's understand that, again here, it's quite amusing of the shift that's happened, particularly towards Judaism. Now, what's interesting is there used to be a big shift happen in the Reagan control eras, when things started to be going into this psychotic control by the satanic Illuminati, is that when the religious right actually joined that movement, and for some reason decided to embrace Judaism and so-called the Old Testament, which really wasn't the case in the past at all. Christians in the past used to call Jews Christ killers, and this is very common right into the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s. But, back in the 40s in particular, Jews were looked on as the people who turned in Jesus and had him murdered, and which is part of that story, is exactly what happens. People talk about Judas, but it was the Jews in that area who turned in this troublemaker, supposedly. Of course, there are no documents stating in any ancient text, either by the Greeks or by the Jews, mentioning Jesus. And that's important for people to know as a fact. But the point is that we have been, this whole area of has changed radically in the different years. And there's been many occult books written based on Kabalah and those, because they had this structure there where there really was no structure. people don't understand the Golden Dawn wasn't a found system. It was an invented system that people put together because there was no magic systems before that of any organized structure. Witchcraft as we know it today, because all of these magicians and everything else were all murdered, pushed underground, and all of their books and everything else were burned and destroyed, and very few of it ever survived. The Druids were annihilated almost down to the last man, which is why there is no Druidic system even to this day. Whatever's out there is invented. So all of this was the factor, and then the Golden Dawn comes around. A lot of people think that this was the rebirth of an old religion or old magical practices. It's just not true. It was invented by a bunch of wealthy English flops, basically, that put together this system, which is interesting but far from profound, and deals with a lot of wearing of costumes and prancing around. So the whole idea is that these things are far from anything of great value. The witchcraft tradition we have today, at least most of it, Wicca and so forth, comes from Gardnerian witchcraft, Gardner, who invented it, claiming getting it from someone else, but invented his witchcraft, which isn't even close to anything today and anything close to what regular Wicca is today, because they've changed it all, because it was a very sexual, fun thing to do, and that's the one reason why he put together all that, was because he wanted to have a big sex club. Then there's Alexandrian system, which is a little more witchcrafty, but again, ancient and pagan practices were very sexual based, and whether you like that or not. So I don't like mixing sex and magic. I don't think sex is a very positive thing to mix with most of anything. And sex should be sex and magic should be magic. But it was, this is the way things are combined, and this is the way things are done because of the greater sexual problems that there are out there, which I won't go into detail right now. But that's the reality of it. So when you get into all that, that's what you need to understand, and you need to understand the fact that that's how those things work. So when we go back and we have the very few grimoires that are really out there, when you talk about Western grimoire texts that are available to the public, there's very, very few of them. Of course, there are an awful lot more you have no idea about. Literally hundreds of them, if not many thousands, which have never gotten to the public and probably never will. I've seen many of them, and neither is it a simple task to do it, but they are not wanted to be given to the public, but I won't go into that either right now. So, but the bottom line is that when Christianity took over, of course, they destroyed everything. And what few people understand is that the Spanish Inquisition was not only against people and witches, it was against libraries. They went to different monasteries and they checked for the books, and they didn't just burn and torture people. They burned and tortured tens of thousands, maybe possibly hundreds of thousands of books that were burned and so forth. So that information was lost again. Now, Judaism has survived for many different reasons, against virtually impossible odds, but and we'll go into some of that. But basically, it was this culture of that they were the Christ killers, and anyone who's an older Jew who grew up in the 40s and 50s will say that that's what they were called many times. So they were seen as the people who murdered Christ. So as I said, this changed in the 80s when the right-wing Christians sold out and were bought out to follow that. And they brought in the part of the Illuminati that is based in and works with Jewish factors. So and all of a sudden, as they were our Jewish brothers, they were the people of the Old Testament. And, if you consider the people who killed your Savior that, and, they shifted from the Jews turning him in and prosecuting, having that happen, to the Romans were the bad guys. And again, there's no Roman document that mentions Jesus or a trial or anything else. So the whole idea is that this then shifted to the bad guys being the Romans, and the Old Testament, we have a lot to learn and everything else from that vicious, evil Yahweh who kills and destroys and so forth. So this is a factor, and then there was giving some sort of piety to Judaism and some sophistication to them, when Judaism is nothing more really than a pagan religion with all of its trappings, horrible trappings that a lot of Judaism has. And it's one of the reasons why they're persecuted as well, because they're so odd and so different, and there's a lot of strange and practices they've done, including human sacrifices that have been done even up to recent times by some very conservative cults. This embracing of Judaism, which started with the Ronnie Reagan times, the guy who tripled the national budget and bankrupted the country. All of these things happened at this particular time. From then on, Judaism has been kind of embraced, and then it's the Kabalah Center, like in Los Angeles, where Madonna went to, and you get these little pagan things, magical things like little red strings to go around your arm because that brings you stuff. There's Kabalah water, there's Kabalah stones, there's Kabalah crystals, and there's Kabalah shows. And we dance in the Kabalah and we dance out the Kabalah. And so all of this, and then of course they have what every pseudo-intellectual laws and very complicated, books talking about things I don't quite understand. So, since I don't quite understand them, they're very profound. And, there's a hell of a lot of them. Stacks, and, they were written a long time ago. Yes. So you find it all together as that typical glossed over Hollywood veneer of there's something fabulous here. Well, and here we go with the usual conundrum of these types of situations of people who are so magically empowered who have been murdered from the beginning of time by the millions, right up into the 20th century. So the whole idea is that, and continue to be, around the world. So, this is the kind of silliness that continues to go on of people seeking that there's somehow some great empowerment or extreme magic there. And I've known a lot of Jews and met one who thought he was even a semi-messiah. And, it was all Jew this, Jew that, Jew this. This is the greatest technology in the world. And, of course, he was always seeking something else because none of that technology really ever worked for him. So all their little traditions, all their other things are religious-based, and they're really not magical in any aspect. Now, people have taken these things, and I guess we could go back, and I haven't really followed the history because it just bores me to tears, the Kabalah and the Tree of Life and all the things connected to that. I mean, there are certain entities and so forth, Solomon's lesser and greater keys, and dealing with these spirits that people claim have great empowerment. But again, here we go, people that use all these systems don't seem to be able to achieve much of anything. Now, of course, there's all types of Judaism like there is all types of Christianity. I mean, you've got your very super conservative types, like, what is it, Osmic Day, whatever these people are, this Catholic fanaticism group that is extremely conservative. And you have the very liberal sects of Christianity, and there's so many of them, Baptists, the Methodists, all of these are Christians, the Mormons, and they all have their own little kinky, weird, and strange things that they do. And so, I mean, it's not unusual that, Orthodox Judaism is also very strange with their goofy little hats and their the way they wear their hair, and they can't cut their beard. I mean, all these little stupid, silly things that were done at a particular period of time for whatever reason. I'm sure it goes back to some reason, just like dietary laws, which are very common because people needed help and everything. You got to remember that, quote, witch doctors or priests were healers, and they were general people you came for advice, and they were the elders of the tribe, and a lot had to do with actually, and this goes back through all the African tribes. Through recent research, I just found out is that they told people what to eat. This includes all these African tribes, all the voodoo people, etc. They were involved with it, and they were healers. A big part of witch doctor quite work, to use that terminology, or sorcerers, as we call them, was the fact that they were involved in healing. It was a big part of it because, we all want to blame, we got terrible food, we live in these terrible environments, and we're all sick. Well, it's true, but this is not a new condition. People have been sick and dying for as long as there's been humans. So you didn't just go to the tribe to help yourself find a girl and make some extra money. You went there because you were sick and needed to get rid of evil spirits that were plaguing you. So it was very important. That was a big part of what they did. So this is where dietary laws come in as well, is that the dietary laws of what you eat, not eating pork, not eating fish, like you're not supposed to eat lobster or catfish because they are bottom feeders. They live off of fish poo. And so there may be something valid there. And of course, there's a problem with pork and and if it's not cooked properly, of getting very ill from it and killing it. And I think that was probably a big part of it. So they have these so-called dietary laws. Well, most of the world eats pork, and there's been some talk of how terrible it is. Well, it just doesn't add up into people's long life and toxicity factor. If you eat pork and it's cooked right, there is no problem. I mean, one of the things that Raymond Rife said is that when he looked at pork under a microscope, it looked like cancer. Well, the people who supposedly live the longest in life, Okinawa, one of their main parts of their diet is pork. So, well, with other good things. So it just doesn't residents. The Spanish eat the most pork, and their cancer and illness rates are no higher than anywhere else. So, but there are these things that, you shouldn't eat fish that live off of poo. And maybe there is something to that. I'm not sure that matters all that much. Of course, it does make sense, I guess, in the bigger picture to some degree. So, but that's where dietary laws come. And there's very, very silly things there. And I just can't, it's amazing how many natural outfits that people have from a few hundred years ago, even going but out, of how silly these costumes are. And I'm not looking at it from a modern point of view. It's just silly. These curls that the Jews wear and these hats and outfits. I mean, it certainly sets them off to the group from everybody else. And of course, nobody likes to be different. And when you're different and you're highlighted, this tends to bring hatred. And then you do secret ceremonies. This is part of the problems that people get targeted, just like the Masons get targeted, because nobody really knows what they're doing. We think we know, but so there's so much suspicion. Anytime you have a secret society, you have that kind of problems. And the negativity connected to the Jews, and of course the great jealousy of the Jews is basically been their big problem of why they're persecuted. Now, people don't understand is that in the First Crusade, when there was this big clanking of sabers to get everything going, that everything in this world, including war, and actually especially war, is based on the buckaroos, baby. No buckaroos, no woes. So, the first thing that all these great Christian knights did is they went out and killed all the Jews and stole their property so that they had money to go on crusade. Now, this has been a tradition that went right up until recent years into the Nazis, who were certainly in no way anti-Jewish. They were mostly pro-money, and they went after the rich. And in every country, it was like a bank. Let's go get the Jews because they have the money and they have the land, and we take their houses, we take even the gold out of their teeth after we brutally myrtleize them and their children, and everybody else connected to them, and we get their dough. So if you think there was some sort of anything else based on that, you're wrong, like so many other things you believe. So the idea is that that's what happened, and this has been a cycle of persecuting the Jews because people are jealous of them. And why are the Jews, they like to say, and this Messiah I met who lived in Pacific Palisades, whose wife was a so-called medical radiesthesia expert, meaning pendulum who was far from that as well. I mean, they were nice people. I liked them, but, it's very hard to deal with anybody who's, yeah, that's nice, but what about this Jewish thing? And what about that Jewish thing? I don't give a fuck. I don't care whose religion it is. All religion is poison. It doesn't matter where it comes from. So it's hard to deal with it, but it's unfortunate because this guy was a nice guy and he can play a hell of a piano. And of course, unlike so many occultists, they were intelligent and could speak well. If you could keep them off everybody. And of course, everybody in the world was who was successful was Jewish. And of course, it is true that there is a lot of that, and I'll discuss why that is. And not because they're not because they're chosen, probably because they're unchosen. If anything, the Jews are the unchosen race. And she was horrible. And of course, the point is when you give somebody that they have 100 different problems within them, you walk away from something with, you have to pin down if someone is ill or having a problem, what is the cause of that, and there may be other areas you need to watch, but you have to be very specific. So, but he claimed everybody, and of course, Vogel, who was famous for his crystal research and everything else, of course, he was a Jew. Marcel Vogel, who was French, I think he's French-American. His brother was a Catholic priest. So he wasn't even a Jew at all. But Vogel is kind of Jewish. And, of course, it's hard to know whether someone's name is Jewish or not Jewish. So it's different, but he claimed absolutely everybody. And, of course, there does seem to be in some aspects, but it's not really true when you go through history of who's invented what, but there certainly is a preponderance of things. But a lot of these things are not true if you want to consider Einstein a great man or not. I think Einstein was a character, and I think it was interesting. I wouldn't call anything that he ever produced anything that had value. As a matter of fact, his theories have been proven all wrong, so Einstein was completely incorrect. He's also judged to be retarded at a young age, surprisingly enough, because apparently he was highly dyslexic. But obviously overcome that and was able to deal with high mathematical principles, at least to satisfy the scientists of the world. But anybody who knows anything about Jews or spent any time with them or understands their study and training will understand why they have excelled so high in professions. Now, as well as the fact of being banned from doing anything else. I mean, you couldn't become a carpenter or some other thing, a tradesman in general as a Jew, because they wouldn't let you in the trades. They wouldn't let you in the guilds. So they would have to form their own little cabals and to learn particular things that were outside of groups. So medicine, law, all these things tended to be things that Jews went into. And I'm pretty much from the Los Angeles area, and the major, particularly in the 70s and 80s, 80 to 90% of the doctors and lawyers at that time, and that's radically changed now, were all Jewish because their families helped their children. Their families emphasized education and paid for these educations. Law school and medical school isn't cheap. They would do whatever it takes to do that and make sure their children were highly educated and put a lot of emphasis on that. Why? Because you have to be highly educated to be a Jew. You have to learn Hebrew. You have to read all these complicated books. You have to memorize all these rituals so that you can do the different rites that are required within Judaism. I mean, it is not easy and it's quite complicated. But if you take a child from day one and put the emphasis on that and teach them, well, you got to learn every day doing this. And I've seen this material, and I look at that compared to medical and law school. And it's a breeze to go through law and medical school than to learn all these ancient Hebrew things. So you can see how that happened, that it really wasn't difficult for these people to then go into these other schools and learn that. And the problem with all that is that also law and medicine, which has a large degree of Jews in it, are also the most corrupt and rotten places in society. Now, I don't know if that's because they've added to it or it just got into a very corrupt system. It certainly is not corrupt because of them, but they certainly haven't done anything about it, including all the judges and everything else for periods of time. That's just changed radically now. That is not true anymore with the lawyers or the judges. There seems to be a large amount of everything, including blacks and Hispanics and everybody else, and even women. So, and they haven't done nothing any good either. So, plain and simple. But they certainly can't say that their great mystical Judaism and the pure, wonderful, chosen people came into any systems and either fixed or repaired them or did anything. They blended in, they made their money, and they become just as bad, if not worse, than everybody else. But that's one reason, and they were isolated, and they have a culture of that, of getting this education that's built in already by learning their religious studies. I mean, most Catholics probably couldn't remember or thought it was horrible that they had to go to catechism classes for a few years. And what did they do? And, I don't know of any Catholics that remember any of that. And I remember the teachings when I went through different areas that there was total chaos. The kids caused nothing but trouble right up to confirmation, which are young adults. It was just fuck around. Certainly nothing was serious taken. It's hard to take somebody serious that runs around in robes and fish hats. But of course, so you have these ridiculous conservatives. And by the way, for a little bit of trivia for anybody who wants to show you, and one of the problems with society is that Steven Spielberg, the famous producer, writer, father was a conservative rabbi. And he grew up in that family structure in, of all places, the rough and tumble world of Arizona. And lived an extremely sheltered and ignorant life, and brought that, of course, to his films with their simplistic and goofball realities that have been produced by those, basically just copying a bunch of serials that were produced in the 40s that everybody of his age range loved and went to the theater at. He was also shocked when he was an associate producer on a film called Used Cars, which was a hilarious and great film, which I recommend everybody go and see, and particularly get the DVD so you can listen to the commentaries. But he, like so many of these people, slapped their name on these projects. I'm not really sure why. It helps get funding. Of course, they get a share of the profits for doing virtually nothing but showing up and say, okay, looks good to me, see you later. But he talked with the actual producers of that, the co-producers of that particular movie, and which dealt with the used cars and the used car salesman who wanted to become a politician, and how politicians in general were corrupt. And Steven Spielberg was enraged that anybody could possibly say a politician was corrupt. I mean, how much further in a dumpy shithole can you be if you think politicians are honest, and they haven't been honest since there had been the first politician? So it just shows you the kind of bozo reality that little idiot comes from. So, and I guess that explains a lot of his imbecile work. He's done some good stuff, some bad stuff, but, his movies, which are just remakes of old serials with a big budget and some pretty bad actors like Harrison Ford, certainly are not profound works in any way. And they're fun movies, and I want to put them down in that aspect. But, I mean, even E.T. and so forth wasn't, it was kind of done in a really imbecilic fashion. There's not much in smarts going on there. But just to show you this is how this person is, where they're coming from, I think is very important. He's a very influential person, and from what I understand has worked with intelligent people for years who have manipulated him. But of course, it wouldn't take much to manipulate a person with that kind of attitude. You wave the flag in front of him, get a guy in a shiny little suit with a couple of medals on, and he's on the floor just, tell me what I must do, master. You're so good. So, these are the type of realities to understand. So that's a little bit of trivia that helps. So getting back to all this change in this whole Judaism structure is that all these born-again Christians started loving the Jews, when in general the born-again Christians hated the Jews in time immemorial. But this changed it's all part of the deal they made and the emphasis that went on that they had to start going after the Jews because they were part of the Illuminati that they were joining, the Black Lodges, or at least some of them. And certainly there's no Jewish conspiracy that I'm aware of like anything else. Are they involved in it like everybody else? Well, of course, all rich people are, and those are involved. So it's all part of it. They're no worse, again, and no better than anybody else. But ultimately, the Jews also have a very arrogant attitude. I was telling you about the Messiah I met. The fact is that he spouted basically a reverse. Basically, it was like listening to Hitler, except he was wearing a Jewish symbol. They were the greatest. They did everything. They're going to save the world, and blah, blah, blah. So it was quite shocking to do that, and also to say that to a guy named Thor and his German wife. So it's kind of amusing. But the all in all, it's funny their beliefs, and it gets back to the fact of this intellectual superiority that they think they have based on all these endless written books, which are a complete and total joke to the rest of the world. So, yeah, they're complicated. Yeah, they talk about a lot of stuff. Yeah, there's all these angels. Yeah, they're everything else. And my first answer to that is, here's a group of highly persecuted. We're not talking about persecuted. It's a bad word. Yeah, persecuted. Well, everybody's been persecuted to some degree, and it's kind of a bad term. You're talking about a group of people who have been exterminated in the form of you hire an exterminator to massively murder them bugs in your house. So you're talking about people who have been exterminated, and I don't really see how they have ever made it anywhere. They were they were slaves under the Pharaoh for, I believe, 600 years. Let me repeat that: 600 years before they wandered wherever they wandered to in the desert and lived off of dew and honey from the sky. So the whole idea is that where were those things when that time happened? And we're talking about horrible exterminations where people were murdered by the millions, horribly tortured and murdered and raped through the 21st century here in all the countries of Europe. Where were they? Where was this magical empowerment? And, whilst many did escape and did everything, and of course, Israel was formed because of these things, but Israel survived only because of America's guns that protected it. The typical British, as they do everything, just announced that this is Jewish land and did absolutely nothing to do that. But of course, they fought for that as well. And it certainly isn't magic that's keeping Israel alive and vibrant. It's a skillful, dedicated military force of intelligent, wealthy people who are keeping that place in existence today. You could say that at the core of all these things is some magical or spiritual empowerment, and I think that's a fair thing to say. But it certainly isn't the fact that they're doing magical rituals to save themselves and their people, and it is a religion like everything else. And when the tough shit hits the fan, religion and spirituality doesn't carry you. Only real sorcery carries you. And most Jews don't practice their Kabalah in a magical way. It's religion. So, to think that there's anything special about that, I hear about this, the King Solomon's and all this other nonsense. It's always amusing, again, we get back to this fact, they had the greatest things, the Ark of the Covenant, and they had to hide it and bury it. What? So you're under attack, and let's say, some people, if you want to believe Steven Spielberg, is this almost nuclear bomb type thing, and you're coming under attack and you bury the bomb. You don't use the bomb. So, and you got to remember that Judaism is based on the sacrificing of animals to the Yahweh God, and it's all part of their practice, and the sacrificing animals to get rid of your sins. This is all practiced by conservative Jews, and they kill just like, that's why I like to call the judo voodoo. They kill chickens for your sins. It's very, very common. That's what they do. They sacrifice chickens to Yahweh so they can get rid of your sins. Does that sound familiar to you? The so-called Ark of the Covenant, the great powerful thing, which didn't come from Jesus, by the way. It's supposed to be connected to Yahweh, the big giant nuclear bomb was fed through the carcasses of murdered, sacrificed animals that were thrown into a fire of it to keep it powered. So what powered it was dead animals that they murdered by the thousands or maybe the tens of thousands. And of course that was kept in all these great, temple, Solomon's temple, Herod's temple. Well, it's interesting because all those temples were conquered by several people, and eventually the Romans, who took over all those areas and beat those people down to a pulp and ruled them for as long as they chose to. And the fact is, we're going to find secrets from Solomon, and we're going to find some great power from Solomon when he couldn't even protect his own temples and his own people. Here we go again in this conundrum of giving too much credit to that. So, so it's ridiculous, and the Ark of the Covenant being so powerful for what? So it had to be buried, and it may be someplace, and there's some gooks in Ethiopia that are guarding what they think is that, and guarding for what, and for what uses? Africa, of course, is a big giant sewer of murder and destruction. It ain't coming up and doing anything. These don't have any power whatsoever, and it certainly wasn't used to save their own people at the time those things happened. I mean, the treasures of Solomon's temple, other than being made from gold, which has value from the beginning of time till today, there certainly isn't any spiritual value, and there wasn't anything that these people particularly done. And then in the great Jewish hideout of Masada, and I don't know how many people remember that story. Basically, it was built on kind of the top of this little mountain, which was very difficult to get up to. But not for a Roman. The real geniuses of Western society, and have been, and without them we'd have nothing today, which seems to be discarded for some reason. I don't know if it's because, but of course, even to this day, as much as some people like to put down Italians, basically the most popular food in the world is Italian food. Everybody wants Italian suits, and if people could afford them, everybody would have an Italian car. And I'm not talking about a Fiat, I'm talking about a Ferrari. So the whole idea is that ultimately that's where all the sophisticated and quality items still come from today. But that's an aside, boys and girls. But the reality of all that is the fact that, and what's interesting is the Masada was that area or below it was occupied by a Jewish tribe already, and the radical Jewish tribe that took over Masada went in there and murdered all the other Jews to take over Masada. So there's another interesting story if you want to learn the facts about Masada. Well, it was the terrible Romans who went in there and caused over. Well, the point is the Jews that established themselves there murdered everybody else to get that place, and there were other Jews. Well, that's a long story, a long common story. But what the Romans did is they just built a ramp as high as that mountain and took Masada. Just as simple as that, and the ingenious and fantastic way that the Romans could do everything. But there was no ramp for the Ark of the Covenant to come down and break down that ramp they built, this giant, huge earthen ramp that could have been destroyed in a big storm. That didn't happen. It didn't pop open like in the Jewish rabbi's son's movie. It didn't come out and do that. Well, the point is the Jews have been successful because of their isolation. They stick together. When I went to my Jewish lawyers in California, well, all I heard was shalom, shalom, shalom. They were all sticking together, all helping each other. If you think that don't work, well, that's what does. So the whole idea is that they are being forced into professions which people needed and had to go to, of doctors and lawyers, which required money and dedication and a study ethic, put them in that particular position. So, and if you take people from birth and require them to learn at high levels, they do. It has nothing to do, it's the requirement, and they're the people they're around that determine, and of course when you're around a whole bunch of other Jews who are all studying, this furthers the fact of people being qualified to higher levels. And it's just a fact. On top of the fact that they stick together because they were persecuted. So persecution made them stronger, not weaker. But it wasn't the fact of some spiritual beliefs that made them powerful. It was this work, study ethic, and the parents who worked very, very hard to make their children available and pay these college tuition fees, which certainly is not done by too many white people that I know of, and certainly wasn't done by my rotten father. So the whole idea is that these types of things is what has brought them to this particular level, and it becomes self-fulfilling. They used to marry in the family as well. They'd married other Jewish they'd married Jewish women, all these doctors. That has all changed too. So it's becoming a very diffused culture where there's a lot of intermarriage and everything else. So it causes more and more problems there as well. But that's neither here nor there. But, that's the power that has come from, if you're Jewish, to a certain extent, or the reason why there's in those areas, which includes some of the sciences and other things. So that's all the reason why. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Kabalah or the Great Ark of the Covenant of empowering anything. There's not a single religious item or tool or artifact that seems to have empowered anybody to do anything. There are some nebulous stories of maybe certain trinkets that have helped people and healed them. It's hard to really know with these things. But when we get into things, the Crusaders had and carried with them in their banner was a piece of the true cross. I'm not sure if the Templars had that or whoever had that. Soon, Saladin had it, because the people who had that true cross were beaten the fuck out of in battle. I guess Jesus was empowered through that cross to come in and do nothing, which is very typical of all gods. They did nothing with the Druids, and they did nothing with the Jews. So it's the same old story there. The spear of Longinus, or whoever that person's name is, that's supposed to be, whoever held that spear that stabbed the side of that mythical story, could rule the world, and the people who have possessed that didn't rule the world. Supposedly Hitler did grab that, not supposedly did. And he certainly didn't win, didn't even come close to winning when you really look at it. A 5-year war with 3 years of retreat is not exactly a great military campaign in anybody's stretch of the mind. So that certainly didn't work, and we go on for all these things. And if we look at all these artifacts and these empowerments that may or may not be around, they don't really seem to do much of anything, except in the mind of the person who thinks that there's something there. But that still don't carry you in battle. Ultimately, the superior army wins. As the Romans can tell you, who conquered everybody with their strategic ways of fighting, while everybody else, particularly the invasion of Europe and the naked painted blue Celts with their honky-donks wagon, were butchered by the tens of thousands by a qualified, organized army. So the reality of all that is, what does all that mean when we move this back into a more magical context? And the whole idea of this slavishly following the Kabalah, and the reason why people do that is because you've got this whole complete system of magic, including all sorts of great illustrations, all these sigils and everything else that are there that show the different god forms. You have the god names, you have the angels, you have all these things that you work of in your own particular system. And as such, since you have something that's full and complete to go on, you embrace it as at least the first step. But there's intrinsically, as I've just laid out here, there's absolutely no proof that any of that is done. And whatever success the Judaism has had, or Jewish people, most people don't even follow their religion. I mean, people are labeled Jews because of their name and maybe their physical appearance and their ethnic background, but it's a religion, and Jews come from all places around the world. There's black Jews as well. They come from Eastern and Western Europe. I mean, there are Jews everywhere. Ethiopian Jews. So the idea is that it's really not has anything to do with people label somebody. I've never heard anybody being labeled particularly by their religion before. I mean, if you're black, people call you a black person. They don't call you a Baptist. So I've never heard of that before. So I even find that strange. But because of the fact that they were very successful, they were in a lot of trades in terms of there were a lot of businesses because they couldn't get into trades. So they were in the diamond business and the gold business, and they were able to do this because of their connections and their sticking together and their kind of cabals that they worked in secret a lot because they were forced to do that. But they were smart enough to take care of themselves because they had to. They were forced in that position, and since they were intelligent, instead of striking out with violence and stupidity, they educated themselves and worked into ways, and of course, that all-important sticking together. So it has nothing to do with using the Kabalah. They were in a club, and a particular type of club that you really couldn't escape because people who are non-practicing Jews today are, oh, well, you're a damn Jew. Well, I haven't been in a synagogue or a temple in 50 years. How am I a Jew? Well, and that's a perfectly good statement. Well, that's because, your family. What do you mean your family was? That doesn't even make any sense whatsoever. But that's how people label things, and when you're pushed into that, there's a camaraderie. You are forced into the fact of, I'm a Jew, he's a Jew, we take care of each other, we have to. If everybody did that, particularly occultists, we'd all be in a lot better situations. So there's nothing intrinsically, and I know people who've studied the Kabbalah, and you can get endless books on this, and you go to this sphere and that sphere and this energy and that energy. And like all occultism, it for most people, it has a pathetic record of success in general. And it's again looking back at a bunch of empty holes to try and find the ultimate. Now in life and in most things, you kind of look at life as this ultimate is the trying to change a light bulb and using a ladder. And the whole idea is the light bulb is what you're trying to is out, and you need to replace it with one that works. And that it could be a symbolism of reaching enlightenment, literally. And so you then need to be, and you use in life to reach that enlightenment, you use a ladder. Now, a ladder that is only supported at the bottom, or of course you need a good support at the bottom. The first 2 or 3 rungs are very important in a ladder because that stabilizes the whole ladder. But the problem is that you need, let's say, 6 rungs in a ladder, 6 steps to change that light bulb. And what you have with these old traditions is they give you 1, 2, maybe 3 rungs of that ladder. But you're still, and you go up that because that's all you have, and you got that support, and it's interesting, and certainly a damn good place to start. But the point is now you're in the middle of the ladder. You can't change the light bulb, so you're nowhere. And that's what all these magical traditions are, from the Golden Dawn to the Kabalah, is that, yeah, they're interesting old foundations, but you're far short from that goal, that very important goal of enlightenment or changing that light bulb. So people get stuck in there because that is there, that's available, that's what they're going to use. And there's nothing wrong with studying that and using that as that important base. But as I said, you're still left hanging in the air. We need to go to the next level. We need to move up past this. We need to shed all this old, stupid mysticism, which has no proof of that it works whatsoever. And living in a fantasy is not going to change your life. It's not going to empower you to follow some fool who can't do anything, some carpet-cleaning Satanist who's going to tell you they're all powerful. It isn't going to work, or for that matter, some Kabbalah-raving madman who thinks that everything is spawned from this, when their lives in themselves show absolutely nothing. So, it goes on and on with this kind of illusionary thing. So it doesn't mean you throw all this out there, but there is no great empowerment in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or anything else. There is no empowerment that is there because they're old or somebody practiced it. Some of the I mean, people want to give credit, particularly to Zen and everything else. It couldn't be practiced by one of the most scummiest races on the planet ever existing, and that's the Japanese. Read their history of massacre and butchering that they have done right up until modern times, and now as a country who's completely run by organized crime and the Yakuza. I mean, it's a filthy, disgusting group of race of people that shouldn't even exist today. Oh, I mean, you're going to give credit to that thinking because that evolved what? They make a good swords. So, it's pathetic when you get into those things. So going back into thinking that there's some power, and King Solomon, what the hell did he ever do? He wrote some magic books that nobody really gets results from. Not the kind of results that he's there. And supposedly we have complete texts of this with sigils and how to do it and this. Well, where's the results then? When Israel is being attacked in the 6-Day War, they didn't pull out the Kabalah and do spells. They pulled out the jets and did bombs. So, the bottom line is it don't work like that. So we can't give credit to this because it's old and semi-organized. And, Judaism is a pagan religion. They sacrifice animals to this day now is very, very common. I just saw a TV show. They go to the Wailing Wall, hundreds of Jews with their children, to go through the symbolic thing, and they all brought a goat or a sheep with them, and they cut its throat and sacrificed it right there. Now, I don't in any way think that's good, and I think a conservative religion should get past the eating, consuming, and murdering, or you're just a pagan scum religion like anybody else. And there's certainly nothing special about Judaism or their pagan chicken voodoo practices. And, I don't think people understand that, and they do. There is even very arcane rituals that inner core conservatives do where they actually sacrifice children. This is part of what they do. Now, this is not something that is common. You got to remember, so do all the other religions do this, particularly the Illuminatis, who are involved in mass amounts of child murder and all sorts of other foul practices. And this is not something that's done often, but it is not something that isn't part of this pagan culture that they have and their belief systems, which are carried on to this day. Not in terms of child sacrifices being a major, but they are killing and sacrificing animals right to this day as part of that. And they condemn the Santeria people. Well, that's hypocritical and all the other ones. I mean, it's horrible when this is part of that, and they get away with it because you don't want to criticize the Jews. Well, that's fucking nonsense. And I don't know if people know these facts, but those are their practices. Now, not all of them. There are cults within Judaism that does that. There are Reformed Jews, there's mediocre Jews, there's special Jews, just like the Christians. You name a day of the week, and there's 6 different Christian religions, and everything with it. And there's a whole bunch of different types of Judaism, but the conservative Judaism, which is the very radical one with the different goofy outfits they wear and everything else, is a growing sector, but it is even a sector that regular Jews find disturbing. And, if you're not a conservative Jew, you can't hang out with anybody else that is, even if they're Jewish, you can't hang out. You can only hang out with other conservative Jews. And there's a lot of inbreeding with that. So because of the fact that they have this small community where they inbreed, there's a huge amount of retarded Hasidic Jews in particular, and conservative Jews because they have a huge amount of mental problems because of the inbreeding. So these are the other little foul aspects, and I guess the Kabalah couldn't purify that. And, the people who have rushed to that and trained themselves like Madonna and everything else, I guess it wasn't going around half naked and humping everything she could and flashing her ass and pussy everywhere. That's not what made her money. Oh, no, it was the Kabalah that made her money. And ever since she learned the Kabalah, she's made lots of money by doing other things, other than flashing her ass and every other inch of her body. And who So, I mean, the whole idea is it certainly wasn't done in a higher method. But I guess you could say she empowered that through the Kabalah, if you want to use a magical empowerment thing. And by the way, Madonna makes more money in the music industry today than any other music person out there. Kind of interesting for kind of an old person that she is. More than the rappers do. She's the number one money maker in the world. Now, I don't think she's still practicing Kabalah, but did the Kabalah magically empower her through her trash acts and mediocre songs to get all that? Well, I mean, that's an interesting thought, but it doesn't empower the Kabalah to be all-powerful and stop the world. We have history that shows differently, and we have a lot of practitioners and thousands of books written on the Kabalah and how to use the Tree of Life, and I still have yet to see any really results from that. And we can't slavishly follow anything from the past. If it's the first couple of rungs on that ladder that gets you going and gets you to the process, well, that's all well and good, and they should recognize, can we find in modern times, can an occult scientist take out of there information that is valuable and apply it into your life? But as a tradition and this ridiculous worship of King Solomon and the boobalicious turds that all these Middle Eastern societies that were easily crushed by the Romans is just stupid. And the fact that he had secrets or treasures beyond the fact of whatever idols he had that were made of gold, there certainly is no spiritual wealth to be found in any of those systems, and there hasn't anybody who's used any system from that particular place of the world that has done anything. The birth of the great societies that were birthed through the Middle East were triggered by the fact of the Atlanteans who filtered their informations up through the Egyptians who the very well ignored, and everybody wants to look away, but the societies that were created in South America were 10 times larger and bigger than the Egyptian societies ever were, but people ignore them because they fell into this huge decadence of mass murder because everything was so great. They bred like rats by the millions, and the sacrificing of thousands of people became part of a population necessity, and there are literally littered the entire Central and South America, and Mexico is littered with ancient cities. It's impossible not to find one in the jungles there. They just haven't been cleared. And that's a whole nother story. But the point is, those societies, because everybody wants to say, how come everything came from the Middle East, dude? There must be something special there. Yeah, there has to be a bunch of gossip that's special there, a bunch of organization from people who are saying how great they are, like the Jews and the Christians, when the greatest societies that were ever created before the great societies, Atlantis and Lemuria, these were the great societies. When those fell, which is a whole nother story, what happened is that they filtered into several areas around the world, and of course they built the great Egyptian societies and these great societies that were based even in North America, who then moved down to Central and South America and built huge, much more sophisticated societies that I say were 10 times larger than anything the Egyptians ever produced. So that's another thing to think about. But as he said, nobody wants to give them credit. All that, of course, was destroyed by the Christian priests who went in there and tortured people horribly and murdered all the Aztecs and converted them into the corrupt evil that they are today, otherwise known as the corrupt cartels of those areas who run everything. So the whole idea is that that's the real story, and people have been somehow think that there's something great out of the Middle East because of the pressure of those people that have come from that area to state that. And of course took over these other areas and burned all the wooden tablets and all the things that the Aztecs and Mayans. Of course, the Aztecs, I believe, came after the Mayans, and of course they murdered all the Mayans and burnt all their holy books. So it's not like this is something that is unique to one religion. All religions do that. So that's important to understand, but this stuff of giving any credence to this, and it's, this hunt for King Solomon's whatever is as boring and as garbage-based if you want to look in a spiritual empowerment. If you're looking for things made of gold that don't have any empowerment other than the buckaroos connected to it, then yes, they had a lot of that, like so many of that, just like the Aztecs had and so forth. But in terms of spiritual empowerment, in terms of magical empowerment, in terms of empowering the sorcerer, there certainly is none of that can be proven from there again. So, everybody has to stay within. If you're an occult scientist, you have to stay within this understanding of not being BS'd and living in fantasies, and particularly having other people draw you into their fantasies. Now, there is no reality until the occult scientist creates it is a very important statement that I don't think people understand very much. You don't let other people draw you into their consciousness. You create the reality that you make people live in, and you don't step out of that into their stupidity and corruption. So that's what that term means. So you don't let people tell you this nonsense because they have an act of grind, because they think there's some superior whatever. Where is the proof of it? You're doing great because you're a big-time lawyer. Well, what does that have to do with your Kabalah practices? I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. How has that empowered you? Were you an F student and you went and recited the Kabalah for 20 minutes and you became an A student? Well, if you can do that, baby, tell me how. And, when it comes down to all that, it ain't none of that at all. So, and of course, they like to think that it had nothing to do with them. They are geniuses and they're so smart. And I've talked to these people as well. It had nothing to do with our culture and our training. And that daddy paid for all this stuff and it cost all this. And I had all these hours of committed training that was done. Oh, no. Complete and total nonsense. This is all about being in the state of gnosis. You have to understand what his truth is. And learning truth then puts you on the path to the ultimate empowerment. That's really what gnosis is all about. So I think that's clarified this issue once and for all. I hope so, people. So let's stay away from all them silly books that want to tell you how wonderful all those people are going to tell you, well, all the answers are there. Well, if they are, then you better show it in your own life on one level or another. And it doesn't have to be fancy cars and $1 billion in the bank, but let's see you do something like let's see you frickin' ascend. Just turn into energy and get the hell out of here, because if you're that spiritual, you don't want to be in this garbage hell of a society. But, as usual, these people, interesting enough, all these advanced peoples seem to have very complicated funerary rites, which ought to tell you about how ultimate and empowered they really are. So with that, old people, there's no reality until the occult scientist creates it. Question everything, believe nothing, question all authority, trust absolutely no one. Learn it, be it, do it, and let the guild be your guide.